In this podcast episode, Ben Shapiro discusses recent violent riots sparked by a second ICE-involved shooting in Minneapolis. The conversation then shifts to ongoing developments in Iran's protests and diplomatic tensions, followed by an analysis of U.S. involvement in Venezuela and the broader geopolitical implications. The episode also touches on the domestic political discourse around immigration enforcement, social issues, economic concerns, and technological competition between the United States and China. Ben Shapiro opens the discussion with the incident in Minneapolis, where a second shooting by ICE agents occurred amid heightened tensions. The shooting happened after ICE agents attempted to arrest a Venezuelan man living illegally in the U.S. The man allegedly attacked an ICE officer along with two other assailants using a snow shovel and a broom handle, prompting the officer to fire and wound the suspect in the leg. Shapiro contrasts this narrative with what he describes as a distorted portrayal by media outlets like the New York Times, which he claims downplays the assault on law enforcement. He details how local officials, including Minnesota Governor Tim Walz and Minneapolis city leaders, responded by condemning ICE and encouraging protests, which escalated into violent clashes. Walz's public statements are characterized as a mix of urging for peace while simultaneously fostering unrest by blaming federal immigration enforcement for brutality. The Minneapolis police chief confirmed illegal acts by rioters, including throwing fireworks and looting an ICE vehicle's gun locker. Shapiro criticizes the Democratic Party's framing of immigration enforcement as tyrannical, highlighting statements from the Democratic National Committee chair comparing Trump's policies to the authoritarian Ayatollah regime in Iran, a comparison Shapiro deems wildly inaccurate and irresponsible. He also points out similar comments from Representative Eugene Vindman and media figures attempting to equate ICE's actions with state violence in Iran. The segment continues with a critique of local and national political actors pushing anti-ICE rhetoric and sanctuary policies. Shapiro singles out political figures like Pramila Jayapal for their sweeping and simplistic narratives about immigrants and U.S. history, which he labels as obfuscating. He also discusses Maryland Senator Chris Van Hollen's calls to defund ICE, interpreting these moves as radical and out of touch with the rule of law. Ben Shapiro defends ICE, citing current director Todd Lyons, who states that ICE's enforcement today closely mirrors that under the Obama administration and that political disdain obstructs objective views of law enforcement. Vice President J.D. Vance is referenced, emphasizing that much of ICE's work targets criminal illegal immigrants and that sanctuary cities hamper enforcement efforts. The possibility of invoking the Insurrection Act is raised after escalating violence, with President Trump warning he might deploy federal authority to protect ICE agents if local governments fail to control the situation. Shapiro frames this as a necessary response to maintain order and uphold the law amid organized resistance to immigration enforcement. Shapiro reports on the Biden administration's announcement to indefinitely pause immigrant visa processing for around 75 countries, including Somalia, Iran, Russia, and Nigeria. This move is viewed as part of a broader effort to tighten immigration controls after years of perceived lax enforcement. This visa freeze, beginning January 21st, signals a shift in immigration policy priorities and reflects ongoing challenges in balancing border security with legal migration. Turning to Iran, the podcast covers the brutal government crackdown on protests, including reports of thousands killed and widespread internet and communication blackouts aimed at suppressing information. Shapiro plays clips and comments on the Iranian regime's brutal tactics, including direct fire into crowds and shutting down both domestic and international communications to prevent news from leaking out. He highlights conflicting reports, including President Trump's mention that killings may have ceased and executions postponed, though Shapiro stresses this may simply be a strategic pause as military repression intensifies. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi's Fox News interview is scrutinized for conspiracy claims blaming Israeli sabotage for violence in Iran, which Shapiro dismisses as baseless. Araghchi also warns the U.S. against repeating the mistake of striking Iran's nuclear facilities, a strike Shapiro notes actually set back Iran's nuclear program significantly. The podcast underscores systemic Iranian denials and propaganda amid ongoing violent unrest, suggesting skepticism toward official Iranian narratives. Shapiro critiques the United Nations Security Council emergency meeting called by the U.S. as largely symbolic and ineffective. He points out the limitations of international diplomacy in curbing Iran's abuses and the regime's continued nuclear ambitions despite sanctions and military actions. The conversation shifts to Venezuela, where President Trump reportedly engaged in direct talks with Delia Rodriguez, Venezuela's interim leader, aligned with Nicolás Maduro's dictatorship. Shapiro notes that the U.S. administration may be planning to employ private military contractors to secure Venezuelan oil assets, avoiding deploying large numbers of U.S. troops on the ground. This approach signals a strategic but cautious intervention aimed at stabilizing Venezuela's economy and curbing China's growing influence in Latin America. He outlines China's historically deep involvement with Venezuela, lending significant financial and diplomatic support to Maduro, and how recent U.S. actions challenge that relationship. The discussion explores whether U.S. efforts in Venezuela represent a broader geopolitical recalibration, where the Western Hemisphere remains under American influence, while China consolidates its power in Asia and Africa, potentially leading to a modern-day division of global spheres of influence. Shapiro briefly touches on President Trump's interest in Greenland as a strategic asset. The Danish foreign minister responds by denying any significant Chinese presence in Greenland and emphasizing Denmark's control over the territory's security. Denmark and the U.S. reportedly disagree over sovereignty and military deployments, but continue dialogue through a high-level working group. Trump's comments are framed as tough but partly rhetorical, highlighting strategic concerns about Arctic defense. The podcast addresses cultural debates, illustrating recent congressional hearings where witnesses struggle to define basic biological concepts, specifically the definition of woman, in the context of gender identity discussions. Shapiro interprets this as symptomatic of a broader societal confusion where identity politics often override scientific and biological realities, a trend he argues undermines rational policy and public understanding. Regarding economic issues, Shapiro outlines President Trump's progressive-sounding proposals on credit card interest rate caps, housing market interventions, and stimulus checks. He suggests these policies, though popular, may not effectively solve underlying inflation or wage stagnation problems. CNN analyst Harry Enton is quoted to emphasize that credit card debt affects Americans across the political spectrum, framing affordability as a bipartisan concern. Finally, the episode explores the technological rivalry between the U.S. and China, focusing on artificial intelligence. America is depicted as pursuing ambitious, frontier AI research aiming at artificial general intelligence, while China employs a more pragmatic strategy, integrating AI into manufacturing and logistics to drive immediate economic gains. Shapiro highlights concerns that China's emphasis on embodied AI and widespread deployment of industrial robots could solidify its manufacturing dominance despite America's lead in software innovation, creating a complex, competitive dynamic between the two superpowers.